The skies over Burma were alive with a quiet fury. Not the rolling thunder of massive battles that history would remember, but the steady, unyielding roar of Allied bombers cutting through the dense jungle canopy. These were no glamorous missions. There were no parades to celebrate their bravery, no headlines to herald their victories. The men in those planes, pilots, navigators, gunners, fought in a theater so remote, so unforgiving, that even the enemy often overlooked them. Yet the stakes were monumental. The Japanese Imperial Army had carved its way across Southeast Asia, occupying cities, cutting supply lines, and crushing morale. The Burma campaign was a war within a war, a place where survival was measured not just in bullets and bombs, but in sheer endurance. In the early dawn, when mist clung to the jungle like a living thing, the Allied bombers, often outnumbered, outgunned, and out of sight of command, rose from makeshift airstrips, flying into a battlefield the world seemed content to forget. For many of these men, the war was more than a battle of nations. It was a battle of wills. The skies were their refuge, their weapon, their burden. Each mission demanded precision, courage, and the cold acceptance that the jungles below were both enemy and ally, hiding Japanese forces one moment, swallowing entire plains the next. And yet, history rarely paused to note their sacrifices. They were the forgotten bombers of Burma, the men who flew into danger without expectation of fame, their stories buried beneath layers of time, obscured by the grand narratives of Europe and the Pacific. Today, we bring their tale into the light, a story of courage, endurance, and the relentless human spirit that refused to yield even in the most forgotten corners of a global war. The story begins in 1942, when the fall of Burma seemed almost inevitable. Japanese forces, experienced and ruthless, had swept through Malaya in Thailand, leaving the Allied armies scrambling. The Allies' first line of defense was thin, their resources stretched across impossible distances, and their morale tested by successive defeats. Yet amid this chaos, a small group of bomber pilots was quietly gathering, men from Britain, Australia, America, and India, bound not by fame but by duty. Their planes were often older models, far from the advanced aircraft flying over Europe or the Pacific Islands. The B-25 Mitchells, Hudsons, and even aging Blenheims that lumbered down makeshift airstrips were not the sleek instruments of precision bombing that history would celebrate. These pilots had to rely on skill, instinct, and sheer determination to achieve missions that, on paper, seemed almost impossible. Every sortie was a gamble. Dense jungle terrain below, limited intelligence, unpredictable weather, and the ever-present threat of Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. But it was not just the enemy that made these missions perilous. The jungles themselves were a silent, lethal opponent. Airstrips carved from mud and vines could vanish overnight in monsoon rains. Navigational errors could send a bomber hundreds of miles off course, deep into enemy territory. Mechanical failures were frequent, with spare parts often days or weeks away. And once a plane went down, rescue was never guaranteed. Pilots and crews faced starvation, disease, or capture in a terrain that was as merciless as the combat above it. But despite the odds, these men carried out missions that would change the course of the campaign. Supply lines to the front were disrupted, Japanese convoys ambushed, and critical intelligence delivered. Each bombing run, no matter how small in scale, had an outsized impact. The pilots learned quickly that success depended not on technology, but on ingenuity. Low-level attacks allowed them to avoid detection, flying under the radar, literally, to strike at bridges, railways, and supply depots. They adapted to the jungle's rhythm,
timing missions to the sun, the winds, even the movements of the river currents below. Among them was Flight Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Harrow, a young pilot from London whose calm under pressure became legendary among his squadron. On one mission, his bomber was struck by enemy fire over the Irrawaddy River. With engines failing and smoke choking the cabin, Jimmy maneuvered the aircraft low over the treetops, dodging Japanese fighters in a desperate bid to reach friendly lines. His plane crashed, but not before dropping its payload on a vital Japanese supply depot, crippling enemy operations in the region. Stories like his were common among these men, though few would ever see newspapers or history books recount them. Even ground crews played their part in this forgotten theater. Mechanics worked in tents and bamboo shacks, repairing planes with limited tools and improvised ingenuity. Often they worked through the night, under the constant threat of air raids, knowing that a single mistake could doom the next mission. Their labor was quiet but essential, ensuring that every bomber could take to the skies again, laden with bombs and resolve.
And then there were the navigators and gunners who had to master the treacherous terrain from above. Dense jungles made targeting difficult, and smoke and haze often obscured enemy positions. A miscalculation could send a plane crashing into trees or over cliffs, making precision as much a matter of survival as of mission success. Through it all, these men and women endured, often without recognition. Letters home were scarce, and those that were sent had to be censored. The outside world barely knew the names of the bases scattered across Burma, places like Dinjan, Imphal, and Myitkyina. Yet in these hidden corners of the world, history was being made, one flight at a time. The forgotten bombers of Burma were not just fighting a war, they were fighting to be remembered, even if only by each other. And in the skies above the relentless green expanse, they carved out their own legacy, one mission, one daring maneuver, one act of bravery at a time. As the Allied bombing campaigns over Burma intensified, the pilots began to understand the true scale of their challenge. Flying was never just about altitude and speed. It was a test of wits, nerves, and adaptability. Weather could change in an instant, with torrential rains reducing visibility to almost nothing and turning the dirt airstrips into quagmires that could swallow an aircraft whole. The monsoon season became a silent enemy, grounding missions, delaying supplies, and complicating every strategic decision. Yet, even in the worst conditions, the crews pressed on. They learned to read the jungle from the air, the way rivers twisted through dense canopies, the faint trails where supply convoys moved, and the hidden bridges whose destruction could paralyze enemy operations for days. Intelligence was scarce, often gathered from local villagers or captured documents, and pilots had to improvise constantly. A single misjudgment could mean not only mission failure, but death. One memorable mission involved a squadron tasked with destroying a Japanese supply convoy moving along a narrow river in northern Burma. The planes flew at treetop level, weaving between the massive canopy and dodging Japanese fighters. The bombardier, Lieutenant Arthur "Art" Simmons, had never been more focused in his life. Every second mattered. He released the bombs with split-second timing, watching as they struck the supply boats, sending them up in flames. The pilots barely escaped a counterattack, returning to base exhausted, soaked from sudden monsoon rains, yet buoyed by the knowledge that they had dealt the enemy a critical blow. Life at the airstrips was no less demanding. These bases were carved out of the jungle with limited resources, often nothing more than mud, bamboo, and canvas shelters. The living conditions were harsh. Malaria, dysentery, and other tropical diseases claimed more lives than bullets or bombs. Yet the men carried on, bonded by shared hardship and a sense of purpose. They trained constantly, repaired planes by hand, and celebrated victories quietly, knowing that the war outside Burma rarely recognized their contributions. Camaraderie became their lifeline. Pilots, gunners, navigators, and ground crews formed tight-knit communities where each member's survival was interconnected. Stories of selflessness abound. Sergeant Rajan, an Indian mechanic, once ran into a burning hangar to rescue a fellow crew member trapped under wreckage, ignoring the flames until help arrived. In the chaos of war, such acts were commonplace, yet rarely acknowledged. The Japanese forces, aware of the disruption caused by Allied bombers, adapted quickly. Anti-aircraft positions were concealed deep within the jungle, and fighter planes patrolled aggressively. Yet the Allied pilots learned to use the jungle to their advantage. Low-level flights, deceptive maneuvers, and night raids became their signature tactics. They struck swiftly, then vanished back into the misty canopy, leaving confusion and destruction behind.
Among these daring pilots was squadron leader Robert "Rob" Hastings, whose precision and leadership saved countless missions. On one harrowing sortie, his squadron was ambushed by a formation of Japanese Zeros. Despite heavy fire, Rob coordinated evasive maneuvers, guiding his bombers through a perilous jungle corridor. They completed their mission and returned with minimal losses, an achievement that seemed miraculous given the circumstances. The psychological toll of this relentless warfare was immense. Pilots witnessed friends and comrades fall, sometimes in ways so sudden that there was no time to process the loss. Letters home were full of reassurances and withheld fears, masking the reality of what life in Burma entailed. Many turned to humor, storytelling, and small rituals to maintain sanity amidst the relentless tension. Even as the Allies gained ground, the struggle for Burma was far from over. Every village liberated, every bridge destroyed, and every supply line cut came at a steep cost. The jungles remained unforgiving, concealing enemy movements, harboring disease, and challenging even the most skilled pilots. Yet the persistence of these men, pilots, gunners, and crews alike, kept the campaign alive. Their contribution, though overshadowed by larger battles in Europe and the Pacific, was vital in slowing the Japanese advance and securing the path for future Allied operations. The story of the forgotten bombers of Burma is not merely one of military strategy or tactical brilliance. It is a story of endurance, courage, and humanity tested in extremity. In the myth-shrouded jungles and perilous skies, they carved out a legacy of determination that refused to be forgotten. If only someone remembered to tell their tale. By late 1943, the Burma campaign had reached a critical juncture. The Japanese held strong positions along key river valleys and rail lines, making conventional assaults nearly impossible. The Allied command realized that the only way to make a decisive impact was from the air. This elevated the role of the bomber squadrons, transforming them into instruments of both destruction and hope. The pilots had become masters of improvisation. Many missions required split-second decisions, altering flight paths mid-air, calculating fuel consumption under unpredictable conditions, and constantly reassessing the enemy's strength. Navigators relied on primitive maps, the sun, and landmarks barely visible through the dense canopy. One error could lead a plane miles off course, into enemy territory or into the treacherous hills and rivers of Burma, where rescue was uncertain at best.
Life on the forward airstrips continued to test every man. The bases were rudimentary: bamboo barracks, mud floors, and canvas tents. Monsoon rains turned airstrips into quagmires, grounding planes for days at a time and leaving crews exposed to insects, leeches, and tropical diseases. Medical care was minimal, and illnesses spread quickly, claiming more men than combat in some squadrons. Yet, despite these hardships, the men found resilience in routine, laughter, and camaraderie. Shared meals of rice, dried fish, and occasional tinned meat became a small comfort in a world defined by uncertainty. One of the most daring operations came in early 1944 when a squadron was tasked with destroying Japanese supply depots along the Chinduan River. The river was flanked by steep cliffs and dense jungle, making navigation and targeting exceptionally difficult. Flight Lieutenant Charlie Benson led the strike, piloting his bomber at treetop height to avoid radar detection. Japanese anti-aircraft fire lit up the sky like a fireworks display, but Charlie maintained composure, guiding his crew to drop bombs with deadly accuracy. When they returned to base, exhausted and soaked from sudden monsoon showers, the impact of their mission became clear. Several enemy supply lines were destroyed, buying precious time for Allied ground forces. Rescue and survival operations were another facet of these pilots' lives. When planes were shot down or crash-landed, the jungles became a labyrinth of danger. Japanese patrols, hostile wildlife, and disease claimed many who fell into the undergrowth. Yet some men survived against all odds. Sergeant Tom Wallace, a navigator whose plane went down behind enemy lines, spent weeks trekking through the jungle, aided by local villagers and his own wits. His survival story, though harrowing, became legendary among his squadron, exemplifying the courage and endurance demanded by the Burma theater. The human cost was undeniable. Losses mounted, and grief became a constant companion. Yet these men persevered. Letters home were censored, often masking the true danger of their daily existence, leaving families unaware of the immense risk faced by their loved ones. Despite this, morale remained high within the squadrons, fueled by small victories, camaraderie, and the unwavering belief that their work mattered.
Even the Japanese respected the tenacity of these bombers. Pilots and commanders often spoke of Allied airmen with a grudging admiration, recognizing that the combination of skill, daring, and relentless perseverance made them formidable opponents. This acknowledgement, however, never filtered through to the public consciousness. Europe's great battles dominated newspapers and newsreels, while the skies of Burma remained a theater forgotten by the world. The forgotten bombers of Burma also had an unheralded impact on strategy. Their missions disrupted Japanese supply lines, weakened morale, and forced the enemy to divert troops to protect vital routes. These small, targeted strikes complemented broader operations, laying the groundwork for future Allied advances in Southeast Asia. In many ways, the successes of these squadrons helped tilt the balance in a campaign where conventional victories were rare and every advantage counted. Amid the chaos, personal stories of bravery continued to emerge. Pilot James Harrow returned to Burma after recovering from a previous crash, determined to complete the missions he had started. Flight engineer William or Bill O'Connor risked his life multiple times to repair aircraft under enemy fire. Gunners and navigators performed feats of skill that defied odds, often becoming the deciding factor between survival and death. Together, these men formed a network of courage and resilience, proving that heroism was not always measured by medals or headlines, but by persistence, loyalty, and unwavering commitment. The jungles of Burma were both enemy and ally. The dense canopy concealed planes from detection, provided cover for ambushes, and tested the limits of aerial skill. Pilots learned to read the subtle signs of the terrain, the shimmer of a river in sunlight, the telltale smoke of hidden supply depots, and the patterns of enemy movement. In these hidden skies, ingenuity often mattered more than firepower.
As the campaign progressed into 1945, the impact of these operations became increasingly evident. Allied ground forces began to advance, supported by the relentless strikes from above. Every bombing run, every daring low-level flight, and every mission flown into the unknown contributed to a slow but steady shift in the balance of power. The pilots, often unnoticed by the world outside the jungles, had become a crucial lifeline for the broader campaign. The forgotten bombers of Burma, though overlooked by history, embodied the essence of courage in extremis. They fought not for glory or recognition, but because it was their duty, because the lives of comrades and civilians depended on their actions, and because they believed in a cause larger than themselves. Their story, hidden for decades, reminds us that even in the most forgotten corners of the world, ordinary men can achieve extraordinary feats. By early 1945, the tide of the Burma campaign had begun to turn. Years of grueling conflict, countless missions, and unimaginable sacrifices had gradually eroded the Japanese hold on the region. The jungles that had once concealed enemy positions now witnessed the relentless advance of Allied forces, bolstered by the tireless support of the bomber squadrons. These pilots, often flying in extreme weather under constant threat from anti-aircraft fire and enemy fighters, had become indispensable to the overall strategy. One of the pivotal operations during this period was the support of the Allied advance along the Irrawaddy River. Japanese troops, desperate and increasingly overstretched, relied heavily on supply lines that were now under constant aerial assault. Bomber squadrons struck bridges, river convoys, and supply depots with precision. Flight Lieutenant Peter Lawson recalled the tension before one mission. We knew the stakes. One missed target could mean our troops walking into ambushes, or worse. But when we released those bombs, there was a clarity, a focus on what needed to be done. Many such missions involved navigating treacherous jungle terrain at low altitudes, dodging enemy fire while remaining undetected. The pilots' courage was matched only by their skill.
Not all missions ended successfully. Some bombers never returned. Crashed aircraft in remote jungle areas became tombs for brave men whose names history barely remembers. Yet these losses were absorbed with grim determination. Survival depended not only on skill, but on the bonds formed between crew members. Pilots, gunners, and navigators trusted one another implicitly, often relying on split-second decisions that could mean life or death. Rescue operations behind enemy lines were harrowing. When aircraft were downed, crews often depended on local villagers who risked their own lives to guide them back to safety. These civilians, sometimes overlooked in historical accounts, played a critical role in the survival of many airmen. Their knowledge of the jungle, the rivers, and hidden paths allowed Allied personnel to evade capture and make their way to friendly lines. Heroic stories continued to emerge. Squadron leader Robert Hastings led a daring daylight raid on a Japanese stronghold that had stalled ground forces for weeks. Despite heavy anti-aircraft fire, Hastings guided his squadron to deliver precise strikes, crippling enemy artillery and supply positions. On return, the pilots were exhausted, soaked by sudden rainstorms, and emotionally drained, but their mission had paved the way for a successful ground advance. Even in the campaign's final months, the jungles of Burma remained a formidable challenge. Navigating dense canopy, sudden storms, and unpredictable terrain tested every pilot and crew. Yet the lessons learned over years of missions, adaptability, precision, and trust ensured that these airmen continued to make a critical impact. When the Japanese finally began retreating in mid-1945, the contribution of the bomber squadrons was undeniable. Allied ground forces, supported by the relentless air campaign, liberated key cities and strategic positions. Bridges, roads, and railways disrupted by bombing raids had slowed enemy reinforcements and prevented counterattacks. Each mission flown by these men, often in near impossible conditions, had helped shape the outcome of the campaign.
The cost, however, had been immense. Hundreds of men had perished in the skies or the unforgiving jungle. Many more suffered wounds, both visible and invisible, that would follow them long after the war ended. Letters from home, though treasured, could never convey the full weight of the experience, the fear, the exhaustion, and the small victories that felt monumental only in the moment.
Yet despite this, the men of Burma's bomber squadrons carried a quiet pride. Their service, largely unrecognized by the world outside the jungle, was a testament to perseverance and courage. They had flown into danger repeatedly without expectation of fame, driven only by duty and the knowledge that their actions saved lives and contributed to a larger purpose. The legacy of the forgotten bombers of Burma is one of resilience. They exemplify the spirit of those who serve in obscurity, whose efforts may never grace textbooks or headlines, but whose impact is profound. They remind us that history is shaped not only by grand battles or famous generals, but also by the quiet determination of those who fight in the shadows, whose bravery ensures that others may live in triumph. Even decades later, veterans of these squadrons speak with a mix of pride and humility. The friendships forged under fire, the moments of fear transformed into triumph, and the countless missions flown in near impossible conditions define not just a campaign, but a way of life. They are, in every sense, the forgotten heroes of a forgotten theater, a story waiting to be told, a courage waiting to be remembered. As the monsoons began to subside in late 1945, the campaign in Burma approached its final phase. Japanese forces were retreating, their supply lines crippled, and their morale broken by relentless air and ground operations. The bomber squadrons, which had been the unseen spearhead of the Allied effort, continued their missions to ensure that no last-minute resistance could jeopardize the advance.
One of the most crucial tasks during this period was the support of evacuations. Thousands of soldiers and civilians needed to be extracted from areas previously under Japanese control. Allied bombers flew reconnaissance missions, guided transport planes through treacherous terrain, and ensured that retreating enemy forces could not disrupt the operation. Flying over jungles that seemed endless, pilots relied on skill, experience, and instinct, knowing that a single miscalculation could result in disaster. Survival stories became legend among the squadrons. Lieutenant Arthur Simmons, who had earlier struck a river convoy with devastating accuracy, later guided a downed crew through enemy territory with nothing more than a compass and his knowledge of the jungle. Days of walking, evading patrols, and navigating dense forests tested the limits of human endurance. Villagers risking punishment or death aided them with food, shelter, and directions. Their bravery and humanity often saved lives, forming bonds that lasted long after the war. The psychological toll on the men was immense. Years of operating in extreme conditions, constantly facing death, and witnessing friends and comrades fall had left deep scars. Many returned home changed, carrying memories and trauma that could never be fully shared or understood. Yet, despite these hardships, there was an unspoken pride. They had been part of something crucial, an operation that may not have captured headlines, but which had directly contributed to the liberation of Burma. Awards and recognition were rare. While a handful of pilots and crew members received commendations, the vast majority returned to civilian life quietly, their contributions largely unknown to the world. The jungles of Burma, which had tested every skill, every nerve, and every ounce of courage, held the stories of countless men whose names were never recorded in history books. Yet, the impact of these missions cannot be overstated. Strategic bombing disrupted enemy logistics, slowed reinforcements, and created openings for ground operations. Villages, rivers, and bridges that had been vital to Japanese operations were rendered unusable. The relentless pressure applied by the bomber squadrons ensured that the retreating enemy could not regroup, accelerating the collapse of Japanese control in the region.
Even after the final missions, the legacy of the forgotten bombers of Burma endured. Their service became a testament to courage in the face of overwhelming adversity. The skies they dominated, the jungles they navigated, and the missions they completed became symbols of resilience, skill, and dedication.
In post-war reflections, veterans often spoke not of medals or fame, but of the bonds forged in those skies and the lives saved by their missions. Many described a sense of duty fulfilled quietly, a pride that came not from recognition, but from knowing that they had made a difference. For every celebrated battle in Europe or the Pacific, there were dozens of missions in Burma that required equal, if not greater, bravery. Today, the story of the forgotten bombers of Burma reminds us that history is shaped not only by grand battles and famous leaders, but also by those who fight in obscurity, who persevere in harshest conditions, and who commit themselves to a cause greater than themselves. These men flew into danger repeatedly, not for glory, but because they knew that their courage, skill, and persistence mattered. The jungles have since reclaimed many of the airstrips, rivers have shifted, and bridges have crumbled, yet the memory of those who soared above the treetops, who faced impossible odds with unwavering resolve, remains indelible. Their legacy is one of resilience, heroism, and an enduring testament to the human spirit. The forgotten bombers of Burma may have been overshadowed by history, but their story is now brought to light, a story of bravery, sacrifice, and the unyielding determination of men who refused to be forgotten, even when the world looked the other way.